My grandfather's house was built on a burial ground. My grandfather built his dream home in 1972 on a plot of land he'd purchased for next to nothing. The realtor had been eager to sell, dropping the price 3 times before my grandfather finally made an offer that was almost embarrassingly low. Looking back, that should have been the first warning. The first red flag waving in the breeze of that beautiful Virginia countryside. But my grandfather was a practical man, a veteran who'd survived 2 wars and built a business from nothing. He believed in hard work and good fortune, not in omens or intuitions. When something seemed too good to be true, he figured he was just finally getting the luck he deserved. The second warning came during construction. When the contractors kept finding bones, they'd be digging the foundation and their shovels would strike something that sounded wrong. Something that wasn't rock or root. They'd pull up femurs and ribs and once a skull that one of the workmen swore had teeth like a human's. Animal bones. They assumed deer maybe, or cattle from when the land was farmland. But some looked disturbingly human, arranged in ways that suggested deliberate burial rather than random scattering. The foreman came to my grandfather with concerns, suggested they call someone, maybe halt construction until they knew what they were dealing with. My grandfather told them to keep digging, keep building, toss the bones in the woods, and let nature take them back. He wasn't superstitious, he said. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses or any of that nonsense. Land was land, and he'd paid for it fair and square. I spent every summer of my childhood in that house, from the time I was 5 until I was 18 and went off to college. It was a beautiful place. I'll give it that. Bedrooms with windows that caught the morning sun just right, a wraparound porch where my grandmother grew roses that climbed the posts and bloomed crimson every June. A basement my grandfather had converted into a woodworking shop that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and rang with the whine of his lathe. But there were always strange occurrences, always little things that made the hair on your arms stand up, even when you could unsay why. Doors would open and close on their own, slowly, deliberately, as if someone was passing through rooms we couldn't see. Tools would disappear from the workshop. A chisel Durand reappeared days later in odd places. The kitchen sink, the back porch, once inside a locked cabinet in my bedroom. At night, when the house had settled and my grandparents had gone to sleep, we'd hear drumming from somewhere deep in the surrounding woods. It was rhythmic, primal, going on for hours sometimes. A heartbeat pulse that seemed to vibrate up through the floor and into my bones. My grandmother refused to talk about it. She was a gentle woman, soft-spoken and kind. But whenever someone mentioned the noises or the moving tools or the way the temperature would drop in certain corners of the house for no reason, she'd change the subject or simply leave the room. Her face would close up like a door swinging shut, and you knew better than to follow her or press further. My grandfather just laughed and blamed raccoons or owls or the wind playing tricks. But I remember one night when I was 8, waking to find my grandmother standing in my bedroom window, staring out at the trees in a white nightgown, moonlight silvering her hair. "They're dancing tonight," she whispered, without turning around. "They always dance when the moon is full." When I asked who, she just shook her head and walked away, leaving me alone in the dark with the sound of drums pulsing through the walls. The summer I turned 16. I decided to investigate. I'd recently gotten interested in local history for a school project, and I started digging through county records at the library, looking for information about the area where my grandfather's house stood. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chenoweth, who'd lived in that county her whole life, got a strange look on her face when I told her the address. She asked why I wanted to know, and when I explained about the house and the summers I'd spent there. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she led me to the archives in the basement and pulled out maps and deeds and newspaper clippings so old they crumbled at the edges. What I found made my blood run cold. The land my grandfather built on had once been a Native American burial ground, specifically the resting place of the Powhatan tribe, who'd inhabited that area for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. There were records of the village that had stood there, descriptions from early colonists who'd visited and written about the burial practices they witnessed. The Powhatan buried their dead in seated positions, facing east toward the rising sun, and they marked the graves with carved wooden totems that rotted away long ago. In the 1850s, a developer had cleared the land and sold plots without ever relocating the bodies. Hundreds of graves, maybe thousands, had simply been built over first by farmers. then by the families who bought those farmhouses, and finally by the developers who carved the land into residential lots in the 1960s. My grandfather's house sat right in the middle of what had once been the most sacred ground for miles. I confronted my grandfather that evening. I'd driven back from the library with photocopies stuffed in my backpack, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind racing through every strange thing I'd ever experienced in that house. I found him in his workshop, sanding a table leg, sawdust floating in the golden evening light. When I spread the papers out on his workbench and asked him if he knew, he set down his sandpaper very carefully and was quiet for a long time. For the first time in his life, he looked afraid. "I know," he said quietly. "I found out a year after we moved in. A man came to the door one night, an old man with dark skin and long gray hair. He told me what this place was, what we'd built on. He said the ancestors were restless, that they'd been disturbed and needed to be appeased." He paused, rubbing his hand over his face. "Your grandmother wanted to leave right then, pack up, and never come back. But we'd put everything into this house, every penny we had. We couldn't afford to go anywhere else, so we made a deal." "What kind of deal?" My voice came out smaller than I intended, like a child asking about monsters under the bed. He wouldn't say more. He picked up his sandpaper and went back to work, and I knew the conversation was over. But that night, the drumming was louder than I'd ever heard it. So loud it shook the windows in their frames and vibrated through the floorboards. And this time, when I looked out my bedroom window, I saw figures moving among the tree shadows that didn't cast shadows, shapes that flickered and flowed like smoke against the darkness. They were dancing, just as my grandmother had said all those years ago, dancing around our house in a slow, circling rhythm, their feet never quite touching the ground. I watched for hours, unable to look away, until the first gray light of dawn made them fade like mist burning off a river. My grandparents passed away within a month of each other when I was 25. First my grandmother, peacefully in her sleep, and then my grandfather, who simply stopped eating after she was gone, as if he decided his time was up. The house went to my father, who wanted nothing to do with it. He'd grown up in that house, experienced the same things I had, and he'd spent his adult life trying to forget. He put it on the market immediately, but it never sold. Potential buyers would tour the property, walk through the rooms, stand on the wraparound porch and look out at the woods. Then they'd call back hours later to withdraw their offers, always sounding shaken, their voices tight with something they wouldn't name, always refusing to explain why they'd changed their minds. After 3 years and 12 failed sales, my father just stopped trying. He let the house sit empty, paying taxes on a property he couldn't sell and wouldn't visit. I inherited the house 5 years ago when my father passed. I've never spent a night there. I tell myself it's because the place is too far from my job, too rural for my taste, too full of memories I'd rather not confront. But the truth is simpler and more frightening. I'm afraid that if I sleep in that house, I'll wake up dancing in the woods with shadows that have been waiting for me my whole life. Still, sometimes, when the moon is full, I drive out to the property and park at the edge of the woods. I turn off my engine and my lights, and I sit in the darkness, watching the trees. And every time, without fail, the drums start. They pulse through the night, calling to something I feel in my chest, in my blood, in the deepest parts of me. I watch the shadows dance, and I listen, and I wonder what deal my grandfather made, and whether it applies to me too. Last full moon I found something on my car windshield when I returned from my vigil. I've been sitting there for hours, lost in the rhythm of the drums, watching the shapes move among the trees. When I finally started my engine and turned on my lights, I saw it through the windshield. A small leather pouch tied with a rawhide string, left on the hood right where the wiper blade met the glass. I got out and picked it up with shaking hands. Inside were dried herbs I couldn't identify, feathers from a bird I didn't recognize, and a single bone from something smaller, finger bone, maybe, or a toe. It was old, that bone, yellowed and smooth, and it hummed with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. A gift. A warning. An invitation. Don't. But I keep it in my glove compartment now, wrapped in a piece of velvet I bought special. Just in case. Tonight is the full moon again. I'm sitting in my apartment in the city, 100 miles from that house, and I can hear the drums. They're faint, so faint, I almost convince myself they're just my pulse, my imagination, the distant throb of traffic. But I know better. They're calling me back, the way they've called me back every full moon since I was a child. And one night, I know, I'll answer. One night I'll drive out there and and just watch from the edge of the woods. I'll walk into the trees, following the sound of drums, and I'll find out what my grandfather promised all those years ago. I'll find out if the ancestors are ready to forgive, or if they've just been waiting for the last of his blood to join the dance.